He was called the Vicar of Christ, yet his nights echoed with laughter, wine, and the cries of naked dancers beneath the frescoes of the Vatican. In an age when art flourished and saints were carved from marble, sin too found its masterpiece. This was Renaissance Rome, a city where holiness and corruption shared the same breath. The church was meant to be the beacon of faith, the voice of God upon the earth. But behind its gilded doors, ambition ruled stronger than devotion. Cardinals sold forgiveness for gold, priests whispered secrets in the dark, and at the center of it all sat a man whose hunger for power knew no limits. His name was Rodrigo Borgia, the man the world would come to know as Pope Alexander VI. To his followers, he was the chosen shepherd of God. To his enemies, he was the devil dressed in white. From the moment he ascended the papal throne, the Vatican changed. What was once a house of prayer became a palace of pleasure. Feasts replaced fasts, and the scent of incense mixed with the sweetness of forbidden perfume. This was not the church of Peter or Paul. This was the church of Borgia, where sins were not confessed but celebrated. Tonight we open the gates of that forgotten Rome, a world where popes plotted, priests sinned, and salvation was sold to the highest bidder. This is not a myth, this is history. He was not born into holiness but into hunger, the hunger for power, wealth, and survival. Rodrigo Borgia entered the world in 1431 in the small Spanish town of Xàtiva. His family, the Borgias, were not saints but strategists, men who believed that faith was a ladder and the church its golden steps. And Rodrigo would climb that ladder higher than any man before him. From a young age, Rodrigo showed two gifts: intelligence and charm. He could quote scripture and flatter a noble in the same breath. His eyes carried both devotion and deceit, a dangerous balance that would one day make him both adored and feared. But ambition alone does not crown a pope. Rodrigo's first true ascent came through blood, not prayer. His uncle, Alfonso Borgia, had risen to the highest seat in Christendom, taking the name Pope Calixtus III. Under his uncle's wing, Rodrigo entered the heart of the Vatican, not as a humble servant, but as a favored heir. Nepotism was the language of the church in those days. Bishops were made not by virtue, but by favor. With his uncle's blessing, Rodrigo became a cardinal at only 25, a meteoric rise that shocked even Rome's most seasoned schemers. He was given titles, lands, and riches. To the outside world, he was a prince of the church. But to those who looked closer, he was a man already crafting his throne. The Rome he entered was not holy. It was a stage of masked devotion and unmasked desire. The Renaissance had made the city beautiful, but beauty hid decay. Gold gilded every altar, yet the hearts of those who prayed there were blackened by greed. The faithful paid for forgiveness, indulgences were sold like goods at a market, and the name of God had become a currency. Rodrigo learned quickly. He studied not the gospel, but men. How they lied, how they obeyed, how they could be bought. He mastered the art of persuasion, the rhythm of diplomacy, the poison of silence. And beneath the crimson robes, his ambition grew sharper than any blade. Years passed, popes came and went, but Rodrigo endured. He built alliances with noble families, filled his pockets with gold, and filled the church with those loyal to his cause. His private life, however, was far from sacred. He kept mistresses, fathered children, and lived in luxury that rivaled kings. Yet no one dared challenge him, for he had already learned the oldest rule of Rome: sins can be forgiven, but weakness cannot. By the time the papal throne fell vacant in 1492, Rodrigo Borgia was ready. The College of Cardinals gathered to elect the next Vicar of Christ, but what took place was not a holy ceremony, it was an auction. Rodrigo distributed gold, promised titles, and traded favors as though buying a kingdom. Every vote had a price, and Rodrigo paid it gladly. The night was long and thick with whispers. By dawn, a decision was made. When the bells of St. Peter's rang, Rome erupted with cheers. From the Vatican chimney rose a thin trail of white smoke, a signal to the world that a new pope had been chosen. But beneath that rising smoke lay something darker. White smoke rose from the Vatican, and with it, the dawn of an unholy reign. Rodrigo Borgia was now Pope Alexander VI, the man anointed to lead souls to heaven, yet destined to drag the church through the depths of its own corruption. As he placed the papal crown upon his head, those who knew him best saw not a shepherd of men, but a wolf draped in silk. The air of Rome felt heavier that day. The streets sang his name, yet in the whispers of the faithful, one question lingered. Had God chosen him, or had gold? With his coronation, the world witnessed the marriage of power and piety, and the church, already trembling from within, would never again be the same. For in Rodrigo Borgia, holiness had found its most dangerous disguise, ambition cloaked in holiness, desire baptized in devotion, and from that moment on, the Vatican would no longer be known as the House of God, but the home of the Borgias. When Rodrigo Borgia became Pope Alexander VI, the keys of heaven turned into keys of pleasure. The Vatican, once a fortress of prayer, was reborn as a theater of sin. Behind the marble walls of Christ's sanctuary, the Pope who claimed to speak for God began to live like a god himself. At first, the city celebrated him. Rome had grown tired of frail old popes who preached humility while trembling in fear of foreign kings. Alexander was different. He was vibrant, confident, charming, a ruler with the charisma of a monarch and the appetite of a man who believed the world belonged to him. And soon, the Vatican began to mirror its master. Feasts replaced sermons. The scent of roasted meat and spiced wine drifted through the corridors where monks once whispered prayers. Golden chalices overflowed not with holy water, but with the finest vintages from Spain and Florence. Courtiers, nobles, and cardinals sat at his table, laughing under candlelight as dancers swayed between the columns of St. Peter's halls. It was said that Alexander's banquets rivaled those of the Roman emperors, though theirs had been held in palaces, his in the very heart of Christendom. But Alexander's indulgence was not limited to food or wine. His heart and his desires were claimed by women whose beauty became legend and whose names still echo through history's scandal. The first was Vanosa de Catane, a woman of grace and intelligence who bore him several children. She was not a secret lover hidden in shadows. She was known to all Rome as the Pope's mistress. Their union produced sons and daughters whom Alexander openly acknowledged, granting them titles and lands, as though divine law no longer applied to him. Years later, Vanosa's place in his affections was taken by another, a young noblewoman named Julia Farnese. The Romans called her La Bella Julia, and behind closed doors, the Pope's concubine. Her golden hair and soft voice enchanted him so deeply that even churchmen began to whisper that the Holy Father worshipped beauty more than God. Julia was barely more than a girl when she entered his life, yet he flaunted her presence without shame. He had her portrait hung in his chambers, beside images of the Virgin Mary. For the Vatican, it was blasphemy. For Alexander, it was love wrapped in sin. His enemies outside the church used these affairs as weapons. Pamphlets spread through Europe depicting the Pope as a satyr in papal robes, surrounded by naked courtesans. The German reformers would later point to his reign as proof that the church had rotted from within. Yet Alexander did not care. He ruled as he pleased, believing himself untouchable. The feasts continued. Marble halls trembled with music and laughter as nobles and cardinals drank until dawn. It was at one of these gatherings that Rome witnessed the most infamous celebration of all, the banquet of chestnuts. The tale is whispered in chronicles and letters, too scandalous to believe yet too detailed to dismiss. One autumn evening, Alexander's son, Cesare Borgia, hosted a grand feast in the Vatican. The hall was lit with 1,000 candles, and 50 courtesans were invited to entertain the guests. As the night grew wild, chestnuts were scattered across the floor, and the women, stripped of all dignity, were commanded to crawl on hands and knees to collect them. Laughter filled the air as the church's princes watched and applauded. Prizes were offered for those who performed best in the games that followed, and through it all, the Pope, the supposed servant of God, looked on with pride. It was no longer a secret that Rome had lost its shame. The Vatican, once the seat of holiness, had become a court of lust and gluttony. Cardinals competed for Alexander's favor by bringing him gifts, gold, art, even women. Priests abandoned their vows to join the festivities. Outside the walls, the common people looked up at the glowing palace and wondered whether heaven had turned its face away. Alexander's greed matched his lust. He sold offices within the church to the highest bidder, turning sacred positions into sources of income. He taxed the faithful, not to feed the poor, but to feed his pleasures. His coffers swelled as his soul withered. For those who resisted him, poison or exile awaited. For those who pleased him, the rewards were endless. It was said that under Alexander VI, sin had found a sanctuary. He had turned the Vatican into a kingdom of flesh, a place where vows were broken and virtue was mocked. The holy city became a playground for the corrupt and the powerful, and every whisper of repentance was drowned in laughter and song. In time, even his allies began to fear him. They saw what Rome had become, a city drunk on excess, rotting beneath a crown of gold. Yet none dared speak against him openly, for his reach was vast and his vengeance swift. The Church's moral authority crumbled before the eyes of Europe. The same institution that claimed to hold the keys to salvation was now ruled by a man whose sins were known to every kingdom. The faithful prayed, but their prayers were mixed with disbelief. How could the man who kissed the altar each morning spend his nights in orgy and deceit? In the house of God, they feasted like demons. And while the world gasped at the rumors, Alexander smiled, for he believed himself eternal, chosen, untouchable, forgiven before he had even sinned. What he did not see was that the very walls of his pleasure palace were beginning to crack. The laughter that filled the Vatican would soon give way to whispers of rebellion, betrayal, and death. But in this moment, in the glow of candlelight amid the scent of wine and perfume, the Pope of Rome had remade the sacred into the profane, and in doing so, he sealed both his legend and his damnation. Power did not satisfy Pope Alexander VI. It only deepened his hunger, and to secure it, he did not look to God or to Rome. He looked to his own blood. The Vatican, once a house of priests and scholars, became the headquarters of a dynasty. A family born of sin, baptized in ambition, and bound by secrets darker than the night over Rome. Alexander's children were the true face of his reign. They were his pride, his weakness, and his weapons. He did not hide them from the world. He paraded them as trophies of his defiance. To deny their existence would be to deny himself, and Alexander Borgia denied nothing. There were three who stood above the rest: Cesare, Juan, and Lucrezia. Each carried their father's charm and his curse. Cesare Borgia, the eldest son, was the Pope's shadow and sword. Brilliant, ruthless, and utterly fearless, Cesare was a man molded not by scripture, but by strategy. He was made a cardinal while still young, but the church was never his calling. The crimson robes of the priesthood could not contain the beast within him. He longed for war, for power, for the freedom to command and destroy. His eyes burned with a cold intelligence that unnerved even his father's allies. Many said Cesare was the Pope's true successor, not in holiness but in hunger. Juan, his brother, was the opposite. Handsome, reckless, and vain, he was their father's favorite. Alexander lavished him with titles, lands, and honors. But Juan's arrogance made him enemies in every direction. He saw himself as a prince above consequence, a ruler by divine right. Yet divine right is a dangerous illusion when surrounded by men who crave the same throne. And then there was Lucrezia, the daughter who would become the most infamous woman in Europe. To some, she was a seductress, to others, a victim of her family's corruption. Blonde-haired, graceful, and intelligent, Lucrezia was her father's most valuable tool. In her beauty, Alexander saw diplomacy. In her innocence, he saw opportunity. Her marriages were not matters of love, but of politics. She was wed, divorced, and remarried at her father's command, each union designed to secure alliances for the papal state. One husband strengthened his ties with Naples, another brought him peace with Ferrara. Lucrezia's body became a contract, her wedding vows the currency of Rome. But behind the public ceremonies, whispers spread, whispers of poison, betrayal, and blood. Rumors claimed the Borgias kept a ring laced with hidden venom, a device used to eliminate their enemies with a single handshake. Others said their banquets sometimes ended in death, with goblets exchanged and rivals never rising from the table. And among the darkest of these tales were those that spoke of incest, a sin so unholy that even Rome struggled to believe it. Lucrezia was said to share not only her father's affection, but her brother's desire. Whether true or not, these whispers grew louder with each passing year, turning her name into a symbol of forbidden passion and the corruption of innocence. Cesare and Juan's rivalry soon became the family's undoing. The Pope's favoritism for Juan ignited a fire in Cesare that could not be contained. The brothers fought for power, for their father's approval, and for dominance over Rome's future. Then, one summer night in 1497, Juan disappeared. Days later, his body was found floating in the Tiber River, his throat slit, his torso stabbed beyond recognition. The city murmured. The Pope wept. But beneath the tears, all eyes turned toward Cesare. The suspicion was never proven, yet everyone knew the truth. In the Borgia family, ambition was stronger than blood. After Juan's death, Cesare abandoned the church entirely. He shed his cardinal robes and took up the sword. Backed by his father's power and money, he raised armies, conquered towns, and ruled over Italy with a cruelty that inspired both fear and admiration. Machiavelli himself would later write that Cesare Borgia was the perfect example of a prince, ruthless, cunning, and unbound by morality. Meanwhile, Lucrezia continued to play her part in the family's game. She governed cities in her father's name, administered justice, and managed the Borgia estates. Beneath the image of a gentle lady, she hid the heart of a strategist. Some saw her as the innocent puppet of her father and brothers. Others believed she was their equal, that she too learned to smile while plotting the next move. The Borgia household became a kingdom within a kingdom. Poisoners, spies, and lovers passed through its doors as easily as priests and pilgrims. Every alliance was temporary, every friendship conditional, every promise made in the shadow of betrayal. The church's sacred halls became the Borgia's private court, where sin was policy and crime was politics. They ruled not through faith, but through fear. And yet, to the astonishment of Europe, they prospered. The Pope grew richer, Cesare more powerful, and Lucrezia more infamous. But power built on sin is never eternal. Every feast they held brought them closer to their downfall. Every secret buried in the Vatican's marble floors poisoned the soil beneath their feet. By the turn of the century, their name was no longer spoken with reverence, but with dread. The Borgias had become a warning, a family so consumed by its own hunger that it devoured itself. They had turned the Holy See into a family enterprise, and the Church into a weapon of personal vengeance. They were a dynasty of sinners, ruling in God's name. And though centuries have passed, their legend endures, not as saints or scholars, but as proof of how power can twist even the holiest of men into devils. The Vatican, once meant to guide the faithful to salvation, had become, under the Borgias, the house of the damned. As the Borgias tightened their grip over Rome, the air in the city thickened with fear. Power had never flowed so freely through the Vatican's halls, and corruption had never reached so high. But for every man who knelt before the Pope, there were 10 who plotted behind his back. Alexander VI had made himself the master of Italy, yet in doing so, he had united its enemies. The old noble families of Rome, the Orsini, the Colonna, and the Della Rovere, watched with growing fury as the Borgias devoured power that once belonged to them. For centuries, these clans had ruled the eternal city in uneasy balance, fighting among themselves for favor and survival. But now, a Spanish pope and his brood of ambitious children had reduced them to pawns. The Vatican, their ancient prize, had been stolen by outsiders, and they would stop at nothing to take it back. Their whispers grew into conspiracies. Poisoned letters, secret alliances, and midnight meetings filled Rome's underworld. They called Alexander not Holy Father, but the Antichrist. Pamphlets spread across Europe accusing him of heresy and blasphemy. Even among the clergy, faith in his rule began to crumble. Priests murmured that the church had become the devil's court, and peasants prayed that God would strike the Pope down. Yet Alexander remained calm. He knew the nature of power, how it thrived on fear and how it could be defended not by mercy but by ruthlessness. He had built his throne with deceit, he would keep it with blood. The Orsini were among the first to rise openly against him. They raised armies and took fortresses, believing the old order could be restored. But Cesare Borgia, his father's warlike son, crushed them without hesitation. Their castles burned, their leaders were strangled in dungeons, and their lands were seized in the name of the church. Cesare fought not as a prince of faith, but as a predator. He waged war with such precision and cruelty that even his enemies began to admire him. Those who survived learned that defying the Borgias was not rebellion, it was suicide. But still, the conspiracies continued. In the shadows of Rome, daggers were sharpened and cups were laced with venom. Alexander had as many assassins as he had priests, and the deadliest of all were his own agents. It was said that the Borgias possessed a secret weapon, a poison known as cantarella. A colorless, tasteless elixir, it was rumored to kill with elegance, leaving no trace but the stillness of its victim. To be invited to dine with the Pope was an honor, but one that could end in eternal sleep. Cardinals who grew too rich, nobles who spoke too loudly, even allies who became inconvenient, all fell to the Borgia elixir. Their sudden deaths were mourned publicly, but celebrated privately. Rome became a city of masks, where smiles hid terror and every meal could be one's last. The Pope's enemies learned to fear not only his armies, but his hospitality. A goblet of wine, a kiss of the ring, a single shared meal. Each could be a sentence of death. And still, Alexander smiled. But even fear cannot silence ambition forever. The Della Rovere family, led by Giuliano della Rovere, the man who would one day become Pope Julius II, plotted relentlessly. He had once been Alexander's rival for the papal throne, and he swore vengeance for being outmatched and outbribed. From exile, he gathered allies, spreading tales of the Pope's depravity across Europe. To the kings of France and Spain, he painted the Borgias as serpents poisoning Christendom. His words found eager ears, and the seeds of rebellion took root far beyond Rome. Assassination attempts became frequent. Twice blades were drawn in dark corridors, twice the assassins were found hanged before sunrise. Every betrayal made Alexander more paranoid, every act of vengeance more ruthless. The Vatican was no longer a sanctuary but a fortress, guarded day and night by mercenaries and spies. Through it all, Cesare Borgia stood at the heart of the storm, commander, executioner, and heir to his father's unholy empire. He built his own state in central Italy, conquering towns one by one under the banner of the church. His power grew so immense that even kings began to fear him. Yet his cruelty was matched by brilliance. He ruled with iron discipline, rewarding loyalty and annihilating opposition. To some, he was a monster, to others, a visionary. One of those who admired him was Niccolò Machiavelli. The Florentine diplomat watched Cesare's campaigns closely and saw in him the perfect embodiment of political mastery, a man who understood that mercy was weakness and that fear was more reliable than love. Years later, Machiavelli would write The Prince, dedicating it in spirit to Cesare Borgia, proof that even darkness can inspire genius. But no genius could change what Rome had become. Under Alexander's reign, the church no longer inspired faith. It provoked disgust. Pilgrims who once came seeking salvation now left whispering of corruption. Priests who should have preached repentance instead bartered blessings. And above them all sat the Pope, who ruled not by holiness, but by cunning and death. The people called him the Vicar of Hell. Yet Alexander did not see himself as wicked. In his eyes, the world was corrupt by nature, and he merely mastered it. He believed that power was divine proof of God's favor, that victory itself was righteousness. Every rival crushed, every enemy poisoned, every plot defeated, only confirmed his belief that heaven smiled upon him. But beyond the Vatican's walls, storms gathered. His enemies were not defeated, only waiting. The Orsini nursed their wounds, the Colonna sharpened their blades, and the Della Rovere watched with patient hatred. The faithful turned their prayers away from the Pope and toward redemption that no longer flowed through Rome. When corruption breeds rebellion, it does not come from armies or swords. It comes from the loss of belief. and belief in the Pope of Rome was dying. The Borgias had conquered men's bodies, but they had lost their souls. And as the bells of St. Peter's rang across the city, echoing above a people who no longer listened, the reign of Alexander VI began to tremble beneath its own sin. He had silenced his enemies, killed his rivals, and ruled the church like an emperor. Yet even emperors fall, especially those who believe themselves greater than God. The Borgias had ruled as if they were gods, untouchable, immortal, destined to reign forever over both Rome and sin. But power, like faith, is fragile. It can crumble in a single night, and for the House of Borgia, that night began with the death of a son. Juan Borgia, Duke of Gandia, was the Pope's favorite child. Proud, reckless, and blinded by his father's adoration, he was given titles, wealth, and the command of armies, though he earned none of them. To Pope Alexander VI, Juan was not just a son. He was the symbol of his dynasty, the heir who would continue the Borgia legacy. Yet that legacy was built on envy, and envy always turns to blood. One summer evening in 1497, Juan disappeared after a feast in Rome. His horse was found wandering near the Tiber River, its saddle stained with blood. Days later, fishermen pulled a body from the dark water, mutilated, stabbed repeatedly, and strangled with a silken cord. When the Pope was told, he collapsed in grief. For days, the mighty Alexander shut himself inside his chambers, weeping as though his soul had been torn apart. But beneath his sorrow, Rome whispered another truth. They said the murderer was his own son, Cesare. The ruthless cardinal who envied his brother's favor, who craved the power and freedom Juan possessed. The whispers grew into conviction. Cesare had ordered his brother's death, and in doing so, severed the last tie of loyalty within the family. From that moment, the Borgias were no longer a dynasty. They were a storm devouring itself. The Pope's authority began to wane. The noble families who had once cowered before him sensed weakness. Allies turned into enemies. His name, once spoken with fear, became a curse on the streets of Rome. Even within the church, loyalty began to crumble. Cardinals who had served him for years now schemed for his downfall, waiting for the moment when sin would destroy the sinner. As Alexander mourned one son, the other grew more powerful. Cesare abandoned his position in the church, casting off his cardinal robes for armor. With his father's blessing, he raised an army of mercenaries and set out to carve a kingdom of his own in central Italy. Town by town, fortress by fortress, he built what he called the new papal state, not through faith, but through terror. For a time, it seemed the Borgias were unstoppable. Cesare's banners flew over the cities of Romagna. The Pope filled his coffers with the spoils of conquest, yet the very forces that had lifted them to power were beginning to turn against them. In 1494, French armies had invaded Italy, spreading chaos across the peninsula. Their return years later brought with them a new king, new ambitions, and no fear of the Pope's wrath. Cesare, once their ally, became their enemy. His army, built on gold and fear, began to crumble under the weight of betrayal. One by one, his soldiers deserted him. The fortress walls that once bore the Borgia crest fell silent. Rome itself grew restless. The people, weary of corruption and blood, began to see the Borgias not as rulers but as a plague. The church's reputation, stained by Alexander's sins, reached its lowest point. Across Europe, reformers pointed to the Vatican and declared it the dwelling place of the devil. Even those who had defended him began to pray for his end. And then, in August of 1503, the end came. The Pope and Cesare attended a banquet at the home of a wealthy cardinal. It was a night of fine wine and quiet plotting. Some say Alexander planned to poison several guests who had betrayed him, a familiar tactic, perfected over years of deceit. But fate or justice had other plans. Within days, both father and son fell violently ill. Their skin darkened, their bodies swelled, and fever consumed them. Witnesses spoke of agony so great that Alexander's cries could be heard throughout the palace. Servants whispered that the poison meant for others had found its way into his own cup. Whether by divine justice or human error, The man who had ruled through sin was destroyed by it. For days he lingered, drifting between life and death. The once mighty Pope, who had commanded armies and defied kings, now lay helpless, gasping for breath in a chamber heavy with the stench of decay. When he finally died, no choir sang, no church bells tolled. The Vatican, once the stage of his pleasures, stood silent. The man who feasted on sin finally drank his own poison. Cesare, too, survived only barely, his strength shattered. His enemies descended upon him like vultures. Stripped of power, betrayed by allies, he was captured and imprisoned. His dream of empire died in the same month as his father. Years later, he would fall on a foreign battlefield, alone, his armor pierced, his name cursed. With Alexander's death, Rome wasted no time in cleansing itself. The new Pope, Pius III, ordered the Borgias erased from the Vatican's memory. Their portraits were removed, their symbols destroyed, their servants scattered. Documents were burned, their estates seized, and their secrets buried beneath marble and silence. It was as though the family had never existed. But history does not forget so easily. The sins of the Borgias lived on in whispers, in letters, in the fearful glances of those who had survived their reign. The Vatican would claim that justice had been done, that God himself had struck down the wicked, yet others saw it differently. Some believed it was not heaven that punished Alexander, but man, betrayed by his own hand, poisoned by the same cunning that had built his throne. Divine justice or human vengeance, no one could say for certain. But one truth remained. The Borgias had fallen, and with them fell the last illusion of purity within the church. The marble halls they once filled with laughter and blood now stood empty. The feasts were over, the music silenced, the candles burned low. The Vatican cleaned its house, but the stain remained, faint and eternal. The house of Borgia was gone, devoured by the very darkness it had unleashed. And in Rome, where saints and sinners share the same soil, their ghosts still linger, whispering to those who listen that power, no matter how divine it seems, always ends the same way, in silence. When Pope Alexander VI died, Rome exhaled, not in grief, but in relief. His reign had been a wound upon the church, a spectacle of sin wrapped in sacred robes. Yet time, as it always does, began to soften the edges. The blood dried, the rumors faded, and slowly, the Vatican began to bury its shame beneath layers of marble and prayer. The Borgias were erased from official memory. Their portraits vanished from Vatican halls. Documents were sealed or destroyed. The church, desperate to restore its image, cloaked itself in repentance. It built new chapels, sponsored new artists, and preached reform from the same pulpit once stained by corruption. Outwardly, holiness returned. Inwardly, the scars remained. Centuries passed, and the Renaissance gave way to the modern age. Popes rose and fell, nations were born and died, and faith adapted to survive. The church that had once drowned in sin reinvented itself as the voice of purity, the guardian of souls, the symbol of divine order. The Vatican's gold gleamed again. Its bells rang over a city that had forgotten, or pretended to forget, the orgies, the poison, the whispers of the Borgias. But history has a memory of its own. The sins of Alexander VI became legend, whispered by scholars, retold in secret chronicles, painted into the margins of history books. Artists and writers could not resist the paradox, a man of God who ruled like a tyrant of hell. For centuries, the Vatican tried to silence the story, but silence only made it louder. The more it hid, the more the world wanted to see. And so, the Borgias returned, not in flesh, but in legacy. They became symbols of power unrestrained, of holiness corrupted by desire. Their tale inspired painters, playwrights, even philosophers. Machiavelli saw in Cesare Borgia the blueprint for the prince, a manual for ambition without conscience. Historians called them monsters, yet also marvels of political genius. They were proof that even in God's house, man's hunger for power could build empires. Yet perhaps the greatest lesson of the Borgias is not their sin, but what followed it. For centuries, the church stood upon their ashes, declaring renewal, purity, and divine guidance. But how pure can faith be when its foundations were built upon blood and deceit? How many prayers rise each day beneath ceilings painted by artists who were paid with the gold of corruption? The Vatican became a monument to contradiction, holiness born from sin, beauty sculpted by guilt. The same marble walls that once echoed with forbidden laughter now resound with hymns. The same palace that witnessed orgies and poisonings now hosts blessings and pilgrimages. The stage remains the same, only the actors have changed. It is easy to believe that time redeems all things, that what was corrupt can be sanctified through centuries of prayer. But some stains never fade. They only sink deeper, hidden beneath the surface, waiting to be remembered. Pope Alexander VI's reign was not merely a scandal of the flesh. It was a revelation of human weakness. It showed that even the holiest institutions are built by mortal hands, hands capable of lust, greed, and cruelty. The Vatican survived the Borgias, but it never escaped them. Their shadow stretches across the centuries, a quiet reminder that the closer one stands to God, the more dangerous it is to believe oneself divine. Perhaps the greatest sin was not the orgies, but the silence that followed them. For in silence, sin is reborn, polished, retold, reimagined as something distant and harmless. Yet beneath every fresco, beneath every prayer whispered in Latin, the echoes remain. And so, as the centuries pass and the world gazes in awe at the Vatican's splendor, few remember what those walls once hid. The laughter of courtesans, the clinking of wine cups, the whispered promises of a pope who mistook lust for love and ambition for faith. The church survived, the Borgias perished, but their legacy, that dark marriage of holiness and corruption, still lingers like incense in the air. In the heart of the Vatican, the echoes of forbidden laughter still linger in the marble. Power is a dangerous thing, especially when it wears the mask of holiness. In the story of the Borgias, we see how faith can be twisted, how devotion can be corrupted when men begin to believe they are gods. Rodrigo Borgia wore the robes of the divine, but beneath them beat the heart of a man consumed by hunger, for wealth, for pleasure, for power. He ruled the church not as a servant of God, but as its master. He blurred the line between the sacred and the profane until both became one, a kingdom where sin was law and virtue was weakness. And when that illusion finally crumbled, it revealed a truth as old as time itself, that no crown, not even one blessed by heaven, can protect a man from his own desires. The Borgias are gone, yet their lesson remains. Power without accountability does not elevate, it devours. It turns faith into theater, worship into obedience, and men into monsters who mistake corruption for destiny. He called himself the father of the faithful, but history remembers him as the pope who turned heaven into hell.